Who was Alfred Tarski?
Alfred Tarski, 1902 to 1983, was a logician. Born in Poland, he taught at the University of California at Berkeley from 1942 to 1958. He is famous for his theory of truth that appeared in The Concept of Truth in Formalized Languages, 1933. Which appeared in the Polish journal Prastorzystwo Naukowego Warszawskiego, Wigel 3 Nok Mate Matizno Fizesnik, and was translated into English in Logic, Semantics, Metamathematics, papers from 1923 to 1938, 1983. According to Tarski, any theory of truth should imply the truth of T sentences in natural languages. For example, snow is white in English is true if and only if snow is white is a sentence. It is important to notice that Tarski's theory of truth does not specify what constitutes truth but is rather about how true sentences can be defined.
What is feminist philosophy of science?
Feminist philosophy of science consists of analyses of scientific methodology and standards for truth. Its focus has been on the ways that the idea of objectivity have excluded knowledge of importance to women.
How did Hume proceed philosophically to create his science of the mind?
Hume formulated and applied, over a large range of subjects, two main principles. First, all of our knowledge is the result of either sense impressions or reflections on the workings of our own mind. Second, no matter of fact can be proved a priori, or before experience. As Hume put it, all the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into two distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. He held that the sciences of the natural world and beliefs about human society are the result of empirical investigation. The truths of mathematics and logic are known without investigating the world. For this reason, they are not about the world, but about the workings of human minds. Our sensory information, which gives us immediate factual knowledge, is more compelling than our ideas. As Hume stated, the most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. Hume had no use for past philosophical projects that contained a priori speculation about the workings of this world or the next. Here is how he summed up this doctrine: if we take into our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Consign it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion.
What was Gottlob Friede's landmark insight about meaning?
Freya's theory of language was set forth in 3 essays. Function and Concept, On Concept and Object, and Sense and Reference. He noted that some identity statements are true and informative. For example, the sentence "Venus is Venus" does not tell me anything, but the sentence "The morning star is the evening star" is informative, although it means the same as Venus is Venus. Because Venus is in fact both the morning star and the evening star.
Are all philosophical feminists women?
By no means. A number of male philosophers have endeavored to both learn and support feminism and include feminist subjects in their own more traditional work. These men have published such books as Philosophical Explorations in Light of Feminism, 1992. Edited by Larry May and Robert Stryckwerda, Men Doing Feminism, 1998, edited by Tom Digby, and Michael A. Sloat's The Ethics of Care and Empathy, 2007. There were women's separatist social movements in the 1970s. But this has never been a viable option in academia. The radical feminist philosopher of religion Mary Daly, 1936, who taught at Boston College for 33 years, was forced to retire in 1999 for barring men from some of her classes. Daly was always on thin ice at this Jesuit institution, especially after the publication of her first book, The Church and the Second Sex, 1968. Daly's work is about how men have appropriated the roles and power of women in religion, particularly in Catholic ritual. Philosophical feminism has evinced strong support for lesbian feminism on the grounds that lesbians have been oppressed in society and that lesbians may recognize the personhood of women more easily than men. Nevertheless, freedom of sexual preference entails that heterosexuality remains a respected preference. Just as freedom of choice in abortion has not led feminists to invalidate, on moral or political grounds, pregnancy and childbirth. On motherhood, for example, Sarah Ruddick's Maternal Thinking Toward a Politics of Peace, 1990, shows how childcare develops distinctive ways of thinking. Although childbirth and rearing is not limited to heterosexual women, much of French feminist writing assumes strong male-female sexual differences.
Who was Franz Brentano?
Franz Brentano, 1837–1917, taught in Würzburg and at the University of Vienna, influencing Austrian philosopher Alexius Menon, 1853–1920.
Who was Anne Conway?
Anne Conway, 1630–1679, was best known in philosophy for her The Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, 1690. This work was meant to overthrow both René Descartes' 1596–1650, dualism and that of Henry More, 1614–1687. She posited an infinite number of ordered monads, each one of which was a congealed spirit, as the ultimate components of reality. She was influenced by Flemish alchemist Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont, who showed her work to Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716. Leibniz himself acknowledged her influence, and some think he got the term monad from her.
Who was Galactos?
Galactos Dixixent Simon, 1890–1967, was a Hungarian general during World War II, as well as Prime Minister of Hungary from August to October of 1944. In August 1944, Lakatos and Miklos Horthy overthrew the German government of Hungary with one tank. While in power, they prevented the deportation of Jews. The Germans retaliated by kidnapping Horthy's son. Horthy surrendered and Lakatos stepped down. When the war was over, Lakatos immigrated to Australia. Imre adopted Lakatos' name because he found his personal courage in the service of freedom very inspirational.
Who was Josiah Royce?
Josiah Royce, 1855–1916, is known as an absolute pragmatist. He sought to combine German and British absolute idealism with American pragmatism. Royce was born in Grass Valley, California, which, at the time following the gold rush, was a mining town. His family moved to San Francisco when he was 11 and he graduated from the University of California in 1875. He then received a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1878. Royce also studied at universities in Leipzig and Göttingen, after which he taught English at the University of California for 4 years. In 1882, he was invited to join Harvard's philosophy department, where he eventually became a professor and led a highly acclaimed and distinguished career. Royce's major publications are The World and the Individual, 1899. Sources of Religious Insight, 1912, The Problem of Christianity, 1913, War and Insurance, 1914. The Hope of the Great Community, 1916, and Lectures on Modern Idealism, 1919. Also available is Royce's Logical Essays, Collected Logical Essays of Josiah Royce, 1951.
How did Iamblichus practice Neoplatonism?
Iamblichus of Syria, c. 245 to 325, was a student of Porphyry's. 233 to 309, who set up his own school in Apamea, in what is modern Syria. Porphyry had practiced theurgy or magic based on vegetarianism and other physical restrictions. But he thought the effectiveness of theurgy was limited to lower levels of spiritual ascent. Iamblichus developed a more elaborate system of theurgy for every stage of salvation, which was similar to Christian sacramental theology and became an integral part of Neoplatonism from then on. Iamblichus also embellished Plotinus' system, dividing the one into two. One responsible for the creation and the other transcending it. The Roman Emperor Julian, c. 331 to 363, became interested in Iamblichus' system. After Iamblichus incorporated many of the Greek gods into Plotinian descriptions of creation and salvation.
Who was Jean-Paul Sartre?
Jean-Paul Charles Imard Sartre, 1905 to 1980, was the icon of 20th-century existentialism. Popular versions of his ideas gave existentialism its dark glamour of atheistic, nihilistic, cigarette smoking, absinthe drinking, cafe frequenting. French intellectuals, arguing about ideas, and practicing free love. Sartre himself smoked a pipe, was short, stocky, nearsighted, and wall-eyed. He was well known by his contemporaries for his work in the French resistance against the Nazis, and later on, for his Marxism and opposition to the Vietnam conflict. Sartre refused to accept the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1964 on the grounds of his political objections to the bourgeois militaristic culture that made such a prize possible. Sartre's main existentialist works consisted of numerous plays and essays. The novel Nausea, 1938, and the philosophical works The Imagination, 1936. The Transcendence of the Ego, 1937, and Being and Nothingness, 1943. His Marxism was developed in the uncompleted three-volume work The Critique of Dialectical Reason, 1958 to 1959.
What was Charles Peirce's philosophical system?
Peirce's philosophical views had idealist underpinnings. He had four systems. In his first system, 1859 to 1861, he agreed with Immanuel Kant. 1724 to 1804, that things in themselves could not be known either in science or philosophy. Science is concerned with phenomena, or what appears in experience. But there is an objective world underlying phenomena, or what is known. There are three kinds of things: 1. Matter, 2. Mind, and 3. God, or it, thou, and I, which Peirce called firstness, secondness and thirdness, respectively. Peirce thought that ideas in God's mind are as material as objects in our experience. However, he encountered logical problems with this system and was not quite satisfied with the relation between the Kantian categories and the things in themselves. In his second system of thought, 1866 to 1970, Peirce used Hegelian methodology and assumptions to conclude that what was most real was a dynamic system. He thought that the world of experience or phenomena, which he called the Phäneron, is entirely made up of signs which are qualities, relations, things, events, everything, and that these signs are all meaningful. The meaning of each sign is part of a system that also contains the object and the interpreton. The object is what the sign is a sign of. The interpreton is the feature or activity of mind that experiences the sign. And, the interpreton is also a sign because everything is a sign, so it also has an object and a second interpreton.
Why did Heraclitus disagree with Pythagoras about the essence of life?
Heraclitus, c. 540 to 480 BCE, thought that the essence of life was an inconclusive battle of opposites. The logos, or rational ruling principle of the cosmos, which takes on the form of fire and is equal to soul or life, is a constant. Within the logos, the strife of individual beings brings constant change.
Who were some important women philosophers from antiquity?
Although they probably are but the tip of an iceberg: Themistocles, Theano of Crotona, Diotima of Mantinea, Aspasia of Miletus, Isara of Lucania, Fintus of Sparta, Paraction I, Theano II, Hypatia of Alexandria, Aspigenia of Athens, and Arete of Cyrene deserve specific mention.
Was Isaac Newton rewarded for his scientific discoveries?
Relatively poor and without family wealth or a patron, Newton finally received the comfortable position as Warden of the Mint in 1695. He administered the complicated project of recoinage with expertise. Echoing Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, contributions to recoinage in Poland about 170 years earlier. Recoinage involved calling in all of the coins in circulation and exchanging them for new ones. Perhaps like Copernicus, and also having the benefit of Gresham's law, that bad coinage drives good coinage out of circulation. Newton knew that the presence of bad coins meant that people were hoarding the good ones. This was a serious economic problem at the time because England was an economy based on cash, and transactions depended on having enough physical money, or coins made of silver, in circulation. Newton's recoinage required calling in all of the silver coins that had been clipped for their metallic value, chunks literally cut out of them around the circumference, and reissuing milled coins that could not be clipped. Newton also advocated that counterfeiters be hanged.
What is fideism and what does it have to do with what Montaigne demonstrated about skepticism?
Montaigne, 1533–1592, demonstrated how skepticism could be a double-edged sword. It could be used to reject irrational claims, and it could be used to attack the certainty of any body of knowledge, including scientific knowledge based on the senses and the conclusions of logical reasoning. This made skepticism extremely useful for Catholic theologians attacking the claims of Protestants, and vice versa. Today, we think of skeptics as those who require careful scientific evidence for claims and judgments. Usually a skeptic is someone who will not take anything on faith. But Montaigne showed that even the best evidence, including sensory information, can be doubted, so that for him, the skeptic is someone who is better off relying on faith. What Montaigne had in mind was not only faith about knowledge that could not be proved to a certainty, but a life of faith in which all attempts at rigorous knowledge were avoided. This is known as fideism.
What was Bertrand Russell's theory of knowledge?
Russell distinguished between two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge by acquaintance was direct knowledge of sense data, mental states, thoughts, and feeling. More indirect knowledge by description was ultimately based on knowledge by acquaintance. For example, I have knowledge by acquaintance of this page as I am typing it into my computer. But knowledge by description of Burma, where I have never been.
Who is Julia Kristeva?
Since arriving in France in 1966 from Bulgaria, Julia Kristeva, 1941, has achieved international recognition for her writings about women in the psychoanalytic tradition. Her work is considered multidisciplinary, encompassing art criticism, philosophy, and cultural critique. Kristeva's primary theoretical contribution has been a distinction between the symbolic aspects of language and what she calls the semiotic, a psychic level of meaning based on a child's relationship to its mother. Primary human desires are attached to the semiotic, which is based on the biological rhythms of the maternal body. Although the semiotic eludes symbolic translation,
Once the idols are eliminated, what did this allow us to do, according to Bacon?
once the mind was cleared of its idols, it would be able to discover causes through experimentation. Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, thought that all of nature was made up of bodies or material objects that acted according to fixed laws. These laws were the forms of material objects. In seeking causes, first we must look for those things from which certain other things always follow. For example, heat is followed by a motion of particles. Next, we look for the cases where the effects do not happen when the cause is absent. No heat, no movement of particles. When what we are studying occurs to a greater or lesser degree, we must be able to account for the variation. Whenever possible, we should invent instruments to measure what we are investigating. In this case, thermometers and barometers.
What did Friedrich Nietzsche mean by the birth of tragedy?
Nietzsche was influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860. Who thought that the real world underlying everyday reality was composed of will, best perceived by us in music. According to Nietzsche, tragedy as an art form was an invention of the ancient Greeks, before Socrates. In order to cope with the chaotic and sorrowful nature of their lives, and indeed of life itself. The tragic play was a rational and beautiful dramatic structure, created by Apollo, the god of reason, which allowed the audience to participate in the underlying, frenzied reality of disorder. This underlying disorder and merging of everything into an anguished but expressive, drunken whole was what Nietzsche called the Dionysian element in Greek life. Thus, the Apollonian element of reason allowed the Dionysian element of disorder to emerge in the dramatic form of the tragedy. For the vicarious participation of the audience, who was represented by the chorus in the tragic play. In The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, which was his doctoral dissertation, Nietzsche quoted the great tragic playwright, Sophocles. There is an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, without capturing him. When Silenus at last fell into his hands, the king asked what was the best and most desirable of all things for man. Fixed and immovable, the demigod said not a word, till at last, urged by the king, he gave a shrill laugh and broke out into these words, "O, wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery! Why do you compel me to tell you what it would be most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon."
What did Friedrich Hegel think was the highest form of spirit?
The modern state of Hegel's own time is considered by him to be the epitome of absolute spirit. This state is a unity that molds its members and also allows them individual freedom.
What are the two types of ideas according to George Berkeley?
Ideas, according to Berkeley, can only exist in one or another mind that is capable of perceiving them. The two types of ideas known to human beings are ideas of sense, which come into the mind from somewhere outside it, and ideas of the imagination. God, however, who creates all ideas out of nothing, does not have ideas of sense because nothing can affect him. God has only ideas of imagination. No idea is capable of doing anything on its own. Every idea is passive. Only minds can act or do anything. All ideas must exist in minds. Without minds, there are no ideas.
What influence did Ludwig Feuerbach have on others?
Feuerbach directly influenced Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and many others. His philosophical starting point of the existing individual predated existentialism. His ideas of how a religion should be studied made possible sociologies, histories, and other non-religious studies of religion.
Why were the great 17th century philosophers and scientists bachelors?
They were either relatively poor, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, or prohibited from marrying because they were priests. Fathers Marin Mersenne 1588 to 1648 and Pierre Gassendi 1592 to 1655. Or it was a tradition for men of learning not to have their own families. For example, Oxford dons were not allowed to marry at that time, and the 7 Fellows of Gresham College, founded in 1558, were all bachelors. Another reason might have been the prevailing beliefs about the nature of women. Women were not allowed to be scholars and wives, and family life was not only considered a distraction for men of learning, but sexual relations were believed to be intellectually weakening for scholars.
What was the Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment was known to its contemporaries and future generations as the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment went beyond intellectual activity to affect painting, literature, architecture, religion, the sciences, and, of course, politics. Culminating in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, and the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. While there were common Enlightenment intellectual themes, conditions in different nations produced distinctive types of thought. Also, there was a marked development of ideas from the first half of the 1700s to the second half, principally because of the major social and political changes preceding and accompanying the American and French revolutions.
Was Immanuel Kant a recluse?
Yes. He lived a very precise and orderly life. And his neighbors claimed to be able to set their clocks by his daily walks. During the 1770s, he retreated into what biographers call his silent decade. He set himself the task of figuring out how perception and intellect are connected. Never a bon vivant, he withdrew from even minimal social contact. But he was very forthright about what was going on in his life and did not make the usual social excuses. When a former student tried to coax him out, he responded in this manner. Any change makes me apprehensive, even if it offers the greatest promise of improving my condition. And I am persuaded by this natural instinct of mine that I must take heed if I wish that the threads which the fates spin so thin and weak in my case to be spun to any length. My great thanks, to my well-wishers and friends, who think so kindly of me as to undertake my welfare. But at the same time a most humble request to protect me in my current condition from any disturbance.
What is German idealism?
It was the philosophical perspective developed in the 19th century that reality is not physical but psychic, or mental. Its main author was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831. There were also British and American versions of Hegelian thought.
What was Karl Popper's notion of the open society?
Beginning with a criticism of Plato, c. 428 c. 348 BCE, and Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. Popper argued that Plato's philosopher kings represented an unattainable ideal of human wisdom and that Marx was mistaken in believing that human history has a moral dimension. Popper reasoned that rulers are always fallible human beings. Furthermore, Popper rejected historicism, or the view that history is determined by group actions, and holism, or the view that only groups are causal agents in society. He did not think that the social sciences had evidence for either the existence of impersonal forces in history or the view that anything other than individuals could make things happen. Popper did not think it was possible for rulers to predict the consequences of their actions and policies. His grounds for this were the philosophical impossibility of anyone being able to predict the future. In an open society, policies should therefore be undertaken as hypotheses that are open to being proved false. Because rulers were capable of fooling themselves and others about the success of their policies, it should be left up to the people to evaluate whether a program was successful. And if it were assessed unsuccessful, then another program should be instigated, subject to the same corrections. Popper believed that if societies were not open in this way, then totalitarianism and repression of individual liberties would ensue.
What were Maimonides' main intellectual contributions?
After Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, and his family fled forced conversions in Spain, they settled in Cairo, Egypt, in 1165, where Maimonides was the physician of the vizier of Saladin, c. 1138 to 1193, he wrote 10 books on medicine, but it was his works on Jewish theology that represented his most important contribution to Judaism. Book of the Commandments treated the 613 laws from the Old Testament. Commentary on the Mishnah explained the practical purposes of the old rabbinical code. And Mishnah Torah, codified Talmudic law in 14 volumes and retains its classic status to the present. However, it was Maimonides' philosophical treatise, Guide of the Perplexed, that had direct influence over a broad range of Western philosophy.
What was John Stuart Mill's final assessment of religious belief?
Mill concluded that, given the evils of this world, it is impossible that there is a God who is both all-powerful and loves humankind. He did think, though, that it was likely that there exists a less than omnipotent but nonetheless benevolent deity. Overall, Mill believed that human beings can control their happiness on earth through improvements in education and social institutions. Still, he saw the utility of religion for some who modeled their own morality based on Jesus Christ's teachings.
Who was Jonathan Edwards?
Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758, was the third president of Princeton University. Although he died a year after he was elected.
How did Edmund Husserl separate mathematics and logic from psychology?
First, Husserl distinguished between numbers that are the result of counting actual objects before us and numbers as symbols. Clearly, most of mathematics deals with numbers as symbols. Husserl claimed that symbolic numbers, as well as propositions and universals, cannot be reduced to mental states, as psychologism claimed, as intentional objects of consciousness, in Franz Brentano's 1837 to 1917, sense of intentionality. These logical and mathematical entities are objective.
How did William Whewell think consilience, coherence, and predictions should be applied to test theories?
Scientific theories must withstand the tests of consilience, coherence, and prediction. Consilience refers to new kinds of cases confirming the theory. A theory's coherence is its ability to explain new kinds of facts. The theory's coherence ought to increase over time. Predictions should turn out to be accurate. Once they have withstood such tests, theories and basic scientific principles become necessary. It is a contradiction to deny them, given an understanding of their meaning.
What are some of Aristotle's works and what are they about?
Aristotle's Organon consists of 6 early works, categories, on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and sophistical refutations. These, together with the physics and the metaphysic, address logic, language, the nature of scientific inquiry, and what philosophers have since called ontology, which is the study of things that are real or things that exist. These works demonstrate a systematic philosophic method of analysis and provide the results of that method in general areas of human knowledge. More specific scientific accounts are found in Aristotle's On Generation and Corruption, On the Heavens, and Meteorology. On the Soul deals with the general functions of the mind, which in Aristotle's Parva Naturalis are applied to specific functions, such as remembering, dreaming, sleeping, and waking. Aristotle's works on biology include the history of animals, parts of animals, and on the generation of animals. The Nicomachean Ethics and Eudemian Ethics constitute Aristotle's theory of moral virtue, whereas his political philosophy is put forth in the Politics. The Rhetoric discusses oratory and persuasion, and the Poetics contains his theory of tragedy as an art form.
What were Burke's main ideas in political theory?
Edmund Burke was a Christian pessimist who believed that there was real evil in the world and that inequality was inevitable. According to Burke, the best prospect for human society was to cling to traditions and customs that had proved their stability over generations. He thought that the French Revolution showed how great harm resulted from attempts to change society. Such attempts at change, motivated by abstract ideals, led to false hopes and vain expectations in those destined to travel in the obscure walk of laborious life. In his 1790 Reflections on the Revolution in France, he called talk of fraternity cant and gibberish.
The Book of Sentences is structured around important theological questions and subjects. For example, is God the cause of evil and sin?
Peter first set out the question or issue, related what the position of the Church Fathers on it would have been. and then proposed his own answer or resolution.
What is behaviorism?
Propounded by psychologists Ivan Pavlov, 1859–1936, and John Broadus, J. B. Watson, 1878–1958, and streamlined by Burhus Frederick, B.F., Skinner, 1904–1990. Behaviorism was the thesis that introspection had no use for a science of mind. Behavior is modified by its consequences in ways that can be described without any recourse to the mind in terms of intentions, beliefs, or prior knowledge. Human psychology was no more than behavior that could be observed in the laboratory. Without considering that behavior from the point of view of the subject who was behaving. Learning is conditioning, a series of automatic responses to repetitive rewards and punishment. Watson propounded the theory of behaviorism in his book Behaviorism, 1925. Noam Chomsky's, 1929, review of Skinner's 1959 classic tome Verbal Behavior is taken to have demolished Skinner's behaviorist theory of language learning, and behaviorism more generally. This is important to philosophy in two ways. First, it restores the importance of how things seem or are experienced by a human subject. Second, it allows for speculation and analysis of how what is going on in the subject's mind is organized and processed in the brain.
What is distinctive about analytical political philosophy?
Twentieth-century analytic political philosophers have for the most part supported liberal and egalitarian values. And they have done so in formal writing that is in itself apolitical.
What was evolutionary thought like in America during the 19th century?
Within educated communities, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was broadly accepted as an accurate history of living beings. Since deism, or the idea that God was suffused throughout nature, was a widespread perspective at the time. There was not an obvious conflict between religious accounts of creation and evolution. Discussion more commonly centered on whether social forms of evolution were ruthlessly competitive or cooperative. As in 19th-century European thought, there were two perspectives: life in society, as in nature, was red in tooth and claw and a matter of survival of the fittest. Or, life in society, as in nature, evolved through cooperation. It is not surprising that the transcendentalists favored the cooperative view.
What was William James' pragmatic epistemology?
He accepted that statements are true or false claims about what exists. But within our experience the world is really malleable, so that truth is also imposed on reality. Truth, as agreement with reality, varies, depending on the nature of what may be true. For example, in ordinary experience, beliefs are true if we are not painfully surprised when we act on them. Scientific truth emerges in ways that make entire systems coherent.
What were Averroes' most noteworthy ideas?
Overall, Averroes, c. 1126 c. 1198, Aristotelian views were shaped by Platonic ideas, partly because he mistakenly believed that the whole of ancient Greek thought was one unified system that had been composed cooperatively. He also believed that, according to Aristotle, all of the sciences could be studied with the same meaning of being. Whereas Aristotle had insisted that the sciences were diverse and their subject matter inherently different. Averroes viewed all of nature as one harmonious order. On the subject of immortality, this holism was related to his idea that individual souls are not distinguished from one another after death, but combine into one form. Averroes also interpreted Aristotle as claiming that Earth was eternal, which was against Christian doctrine of the creation. On the harmony between religion and philosophy, Averroes tried to show that the same truth can be reached through different means, dialectic in law, philosophy for those skilled in the use of pure reason, and rhetoric for those with only a general education.
What was René Descartes' problem with the Inquisition?
Descartes never had a direct problem with the Inquisition, but he was always afraid of church authorities, and at the same time he wanted their approval. His book on cosmology and physics, which was in accord with both atomism and Copernicanism, was ready to publish, when he withdrew it after he heard of the Inquisition's condemnation of Galileo. In 1637, Descartes published his Optics, Meteorology, and Geometry that was prefaced with Discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and reaching the truth in the sciences, 1637. Here, Descartes developed his doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. An idea was clear if one could be sure about what the idea was, and distinct, if it was different from other ideas. He next published his Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641. Partly in response to criticism he had received on the Discourse on Method, 1637. The Discourse explained Descartes' new way of deriving the first principles of the sciences from a few clear and distinct ideas. The Meditations was published with a set of objections and replies from his contemporaries, including Marin Mersenne, 1588 to 1648, Thomas Hobbes 1588–1679, and Pierre Gassendi 1592–1655. And it went to a second edition in 1642. It was a completely original work in its claims that it was possible to be certain about the nature of physical reality and the existence of God based on certainty about one's own existence. Descartes' pre-publication discussions led to refinements in his position that related his ideas to the intellectual concerns of his peers. From these discussions, the Meditations became one of the most famous philosophical works. Philosophers still obsess about it in the 21st century. Descartes became increasingly concerned about intellectual attacks on him by papal authorities. His friends thought that he exaggerated the personal and professional dangers of these attacks. But Descartes' own ambition was tied up with his response to them. His thinking went to the heart of the Catholic Church's use of skepticism to deny the findings of the new science that contradicted church doctrine and scripture. It was Descartes' hope that the Jesuits would approve his ideas in the Meditations and even use it as a textbook. Descartes' next publication was Principles of Philosophy, 1644. Which he believed would be a masterpiece that would gain the Church's approval.
How was Neoplatonism similar to Christianity?
Just as Christianity promised a better emotional and spiritual world in times of great social and political upheaval, the Neoplatonists offered their followers an intellectual picture of a higher realm that could also console them personally. That is, Neoplatonism was closer to Christianity than to other ancient philosophies because of its emphasis on one creator and the importance placed on the feelings of its followers.
What was original about Locke's thoughts concerning education?
Locke originally wrote down his ideas in answer to his relative Edward Clarke, who asked how he should raise his son to grow up to be a gentleman. There was broad interest in this subject among a new group of property owners who had representation in their government and were neither poor nor idly rich. Locke's letters to Clarke were first published anonymously in 1693, and then became Some Thoughts Concerning Education, which went through 24 editions by 1800, 5 of which Locke supervised before he died. Locke advised that the temperament of the child should be observed so that, having once established your authority and the ascendant over him, the next thing must be to bend the crooks the other way if he have any in him. But he counseled a light touch concerning physical discipline, which was an innovation. And he suggested that shame was a better tool than corporeal punishment. Locke's system for bringing up male children to become men of property and affairs involved an austere diet, trained bowels, hard beds, early rising, and plenty of exercise outdoors with bare heads and wet feet in all kinds of weather. The fondness of mothers and superstitions of servants were to be minimized. Locke assumed that self-discipline in childhood would result in strong adults. Locke thought children should be educated at home, by sober tutors, with an emphasis on learning languages. He had no use for poetry or abstract, speculative learning, but advised that astronomy, geography, anatomy, history, and geometry be part of the home curriculum. He also advised that a gentleman's son acquire skill in at least one manual trade, such as painting, woodworking, gardening, or metalworking.
Who was Louis Althusser?
Louis Althusser, 1918 to 1990, was a philosopher who was also a member of the French Communist Party. He is known for Marx, 1965, Reading Capital, 1968, and especially Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays, 1978. His main project was to derive from Karl Marx's, 1818 to 1883, writings a scientific system. He viewed science as governed by systems of concepts, or problematics, that set questions, evidence, and importance. Althusser argued that structures which express ideologies are self-perpetuating, and not subject to changing historical forces, as Marx had claimed. Althusser killed his wife in 1980 and was committed to a psychiatric facility, thereby ending his academic career.
How is Boethius' consolation of philosophy both Stoic and Neoplatonic?
The Consolation of Philosophy was written as a dialogue in which Boethius, 480 c. 525, in despair, is visited by philosophy in the form of an uplifting and encouraging angel.
Who was F. H. Bradley?
Francis Herbert, F. H. Bradley, 1846 to 1924, was a main architect of 19th-century British idealism. But he was also highly influential as an intuitionist. His principal work was Ethical Studies, 1876. In which he sought to explain how morality can be part of individual consciousness and social institutions. He argued that individuals believe that morality is an intrinsic value, which, depending on their social status, they self-realize in their actions. Good selves could be actualized only if bad selves were suppressed. Therefore, the good self requires the bad self, and morality can never be completely actualized unless oneself dies through surrender to Christianity.
What is Catherine MacKinnon's argument against pornography?
According to McKinnon, pornography not only exploits and objectifies those women who are its subjects, but it also expresses and supports the overall oppression of women in society. The subordinate status of women in pornography, as well as the violence against women depicted in so many of its forms, is part of an unjust sex-gender system.
How were Locke's ideas about substance related to his theory of knowledge?
Locke confined knowledge to sensory information and the workings of the mind. And he had a moderate skepticism about claims beyond those two sources of information. Locke introduced his essay concerning human understanding. 1689, as the result of conversations among friends which led to the question of what it was possible for them to know. Given the limitations of human faculties, it was necessary to examine our own abilities and see what objects our understandings were or were not fitted to deal with. Locke's method was not to rely on tradition or what other philosophers had claimed, but to look to the things themselves. Knowledge, according to Locke, was direct awareness of some fact. The only facts we can know are those that consist of relationships among our ideas. A fact is something true about the world. Locke did not think that we had direct experience of the world. Things in the world acted on our sense organs to produce ideas. Therefore, the truths we know, facts, are about the relationships between ideas. Ideas are mental objects for Locke, some of which are representations of things in the world. In Book I of the essay, Locke attacks the rationalist doctrine of innate ideas and innate knowledge. His argument is that we have innate capacities, but nothing like knowledge until there is experience. This is Locke's famous description of the mind as a tabula rasa, or blank slate. In Book 2, he explains our different types of ideas by tracing them to sensation and reflection on sensation. Reflection consists of combination, division, generalization, and abstraction. For Locke, our ideas are like impressions from experience. When we consider our ideas in our minds, we can combine different ideas, divide an idea into more ideas, generalize about what ideas in a group share, or abstract some property shared by a group of ideas. In Book 3, Locke explains how words can mislead us about facts or the things themselves. Book 4 is a discussion of how we are obligated to conduct our minds in forming beliefs, so as not to stray too far from what we know.
Who has claimed that animals have rights?
Tom Reagan, 1938, has based a deontological doctrine of the wrongness of killing innocents, including animals, on the premise that they have intrinsic or inherent worth. It follows from this that humans have an obligation not to harm animals, or at least some of them, for recreation, food, or experimentation. Paul W. Taylor, 1923, has extended Regan's view in claiming that every living thing, from a germ to an elephant, has a teleological center of life that is worthy of moral respect.
Who first came up with the concept of atoms?
Democritus, c. 460 to 371 BCE. A student of Leucippus, Fluid 450 to 420, who opposed Parmenides and Zeno. c. 490 c. 430 BCE, by saying that empty space is real, said that existence is made up of a very large number of things that cannot be cut apart. He called these things atomos or atoms. Atoms are in motion within infinite space. They collide, and their movement creates a vortex. Out of that, different kinds of things result. The only real qualities that we can perceive are size and shape. Because the atoms have that, but everything else available to the senses is an illusion. Democritus was the originator of what became the modern theory of atoms.
What are some details of Sigmund Freud's life that led him to his work?
Freud was born in Freiburg, Germany, but raised in Vienna, Austria. He studied medicine at the University of Vienna, specializing in neurology. In 1886, Freud married Martha Bernays. They had 6 children, and the youngest, Anna, herself became a noted psychoanalyst. Freud's youngest son, Ernst, was the father of Lucien Freud, the celebrated 20th-century portrait painter. Biographers of Freud assess his family life as happy and stable, providing much-needed support for the controversy that swirled around his startling and original psychological theories. Freud's mentors, J. M. Charcot and Joseph Breuer, investigated hysteria, and Freud became interested in the psychological aspects of this disorder because hysterical patients have physical symptoms without underlying disease. Freud and Charcot published their clinical findings of how talk can change patients' ideas as a treatment for hysteria, in their studies in hysteria, 1895. As Freud developed a sexual interpretation of the causes of hysteria, Breuer distanced himself from him.
Who was Richard Rorty?
Richard Mackay Rorty, 1931 to 2007, was probably the most widely read contemporary American philosopher who is not considered to be doing philosophy by analytic and empirical philosophers. He taught at Wellesley, Princeton, the University of Virginia, and Stanford. Rorty began as an analytic philosopher, arguing in favor of eliminative materialism. But with Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, 1979, he began in the late 1970s to criticize analytic philosophy from a pragmatic perspective that drew on continental thought. As a neo-pragmatist, Rorty believed that most philosophical problems are illusions caused by language. That truth is a somewhat arbitrary and relative ideal, and that philosophy is just a literary genre. His main writings include Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, Consequences of Pragmatism, 1982. Philosophy in History, 1985, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, 1989, Objectivity, Relativism and Truth. Philosophical Papers I, 1991, Essays on Heidegger and Others, Philosophical Papers II. 1991, Achieving Our Country, Leftist Thought in 20th Century America, 1998. Truth and Progress, Philosophical Papers 3, 1998, Philosophy and Social Hope, 2000, Against Bosses. Against Oligarchies, A Conversation with Richard Rorty, 2002, The Future of Religion with Johnny Vadimo. 2005, and Philosophy as Cultural Politics, Philosophical Papers 4, 2007.